The end I never expected. I'm Amanda Nelson, and my life has just been reduced to a stack of cold, impersonal papers on a sterile conference table. Divorce papers. The final act in a marriage that was supposed to be my safe place, my home, my forever. Douglas sits across from me, smirking like he already owns my heart, my past, and my future. His lawyer, a man in a perfectly tailored suit, sits next to him, poised to witness my demise like some kind of legal executioner. I sign my name. The pen feels heavier than it should, like it carries the weight of every broken promise, every tear, every lonely night I spent wondering where love went wrong. 3 years. 3 years of trying, of hoping, of silently enduring his cruelty, and this is the conclusion. I am officially his ex-wife. You know what you are, Amanda? Douglas leans forward, his words oozing venom. A complete failure, couldn't keep a man happy, couldn't even give me kids. What kind of woman are you? His words strike me physically, hitting my chest like fists. I flinch, as I always do, a habit from years of walking on eggshells. His lawyer clears his throat uncomfortably, but Douglas doesn't notice or care. You'll never find anyone else, he continues, who'd want damaged goods like you. I do not respond. I can't. My body feels like lead as I gather my copy of the papers and leave. His satisfied smirk burns into my back as I walk out. Freedom tastes like ash in my mouth. Back in my tiny studio apartment, I unpack the few belongings Douglas allowed me to keep. The space is small, almost suffocating, but it is mine. No one else controls these walls. No one dictates when I eat, sleep, or breathe. Yet I can still feel his shadow lingering in every corner. As I unpack, I find something tucked away, notes, handwritten, personal, threatening. You can't hide from me. I know where you live now. This isn't over. My hands tremble as I collect them, rage and fear mixing in an uncomfortable cocktail. Even in freedom, I feel chained. The next morning, I escape to Riverside Coffee. I need something normal, something safe. I sit by the window, coffee in hand, pretending I am just another stranger passing through life. The soft jazz playing in the background calms me a little. Excuse me, are you all right? A voice interrupts my thoughts. I look up to see her. Blonde hair tied in a messy bun, blue eyes that somehow seem to see past the walls I've built around myself. Her face holds concern, not pity. Beautiful, effortlessly so. Sorry, I didn't mean to stare. I'm Lydia, she says, gesturing to my wrist, which still bears faint marks from Douglas's last grip. I work in garden therapy. I know what healing looks like. You seem like you could use some. Her words are a balm, soft and gentle. I want to cry, but I don't. Instead, I nod. Amanda, I manage, and I don't think I know how to heal yet. That's okay, she says softly. Seeds don't sprout overnight either. For a moment, I believe her. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, I feel like someone else could help me survive this. But freedom is never simple. 3 days later, Douglas shows up at my workplace. My heart drops when the receptionist buzzes me. There he is, charming, confident, predatory. Amanda, sweetheart, we need to talk, he says, his voice sickeningly warm. Everyone in the lobby is watching. He pulls out his phone and shows me photos of Lydia and me at Riverside Coffee. Interesting new friend you've got. Does your boss know what kind of woman you're becoming? The threat is clear. A single visit is enough to poison a conservative office. Whispers start to spread. Glances follow me like shadows. My face burns with shame and fear. I escape, driving aimlessly until I find myself at Riverside Community Garden. It's as if the universe guides me here. And there she is, Lydia, kneeling beside a patch of herbs, dirt under her fingernails, looking more alive than anyone else in my sterile, controlled world. You look like you've seen a ghost, she says. Worse, my ex-husband. I sit on a nearby bench, defeated, and spill everything. Threats, humiliation, fear. She listens, not judging, just present. Then she hands me a sprig of mint. This survived a frost last week. Look dead, but see the new growth. Her words sink into me. There's hope. Life can still bloom even in the coldest soil. She asks gently, would you like to help me plant these tomatoes? Side by side, kneeling in dirt, hands touching, I feel warmth rise from my fingertips to my chest. Not just from the soil, from her presence. The world is quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the soft rhythm of our work. When thunder rolls overhead, we're still there, close enough that her breath brushes my cheek. Before the rain falls too hard, she says softly. Before I can think, I lean forward and we kiss. A brief, soft touch of lips that changes everything. I leave the garden that day feeling alive. Confused, yes. Terrified, definitely. But alive. The kiss haunts me, playing in my mind like a melody I never knew I wanted to hear. For the first time in years, I feel safe, seen, and something more. Douglas's texts start flooding my phone. Threats, insults, reminders that he still thinks he owns me. I delete them all, but the anxiety lingers. And yet I can't stop thinking about her. About Lydia. About the warmth of her touch, the certainty in her eyes, the possibility of a life beyond pain. By the time night falls, I know one thing: my life will never be the same. The seeds planted in the garden are not just tomatoes. They are courage, possibility, a chance at a love I never imagined I could feel, in a life I never imagined I could live. Roots of renewal. The days that followed my first encounter with Lydia became a strange blend of fear, exhilaration, and a fragile hope I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Every morning, I would wake in my small apartment and stare at the ceiling, half expecting Douglas's shadow to appear in the doorway, ready to claim victory over yet another piece of my life. Yet somewhere beneath the unease, a spark had been lit, one that pulsed stronger each time I remembered Lydia's touch, the warmth in her eyes, the way her voice made even ordinary words feel like safety blankets for my bruised soul. Work became a battlefield, each whispered glance and cautious step a reminder that freedom was still tenuous. My coworkers had transformed overnight into silent judges, their eyes scanning for signs of weakness, and I realized that surviving Douglas's control would require not just courage, but strategy, patience, and an unwavering grip on the small slivers of life I still owned. I returned to Riverside Community Garden as often as I could. The soil between my fingers became a therapy I had never anticipated. Each seed we planted was more than an attempt to cultivate food. It became a symbol of resilience, of life that refused to bend under the weight of past pain. Lydia, with her calm efficiency, guided me through the process. She showed me how to nurture growth without forcing it, how to respect the time it took for roots to establish themselves, and in doing so, she imparted a lesson I had long forgotten. Patience, when paired with care, could heal wounds that fear and anger only deepened. I watched her hands move over the earth, steady and confident, and I marveled at how natural it seemed for her to exist fully in the moment, to give attention without expectation, to care without reservation. Her presence was magnetic, grounding me in ways I hadn't realized I needed. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through clouds heavy with the threat of rain, I arrived at the garden to find Lydia already kneeling in the rich soil, her blue eyes catching the light in a way that made them seem almost unreal. She looked up when she sensed my approach, and there was a quiet acknowledgement in her smile, a recognition that this garden was no longer just about plants. It was about the fragile human hearts it sheltered. I settled beside her, hesitating at first, my hands hovering over the dirt. "I'm scared," I admitted, my voice almost lost in the rustle of leaves. "Scared that I can't protect myself from him, that everything I try to rebuild will crumble before it starts to grow." She placed her hand over mine, and it was as if the warmth from her touch seeped into the deepest corners of my fear. "The strongest growth comes after the hardest seasons," she said softly, and I realized she wasn't just speaking of plants. "You survived the frost. You survived the storm. Now it's time to see what you're capable of when you let yourself grow again." We worked in silence for hours, planting seedlings and tending fragile sprouts. Dirt under my nails became a badge of courage, each smudge a reminder that I was reclaiming my life, one touch, one choice, one moment at a time. As we worked side by side, I noticed the subtle rhythms of Lydia's movements, the way she leaned close to examine a sprout, how her voice softened when she spoke to the plants, and the quiet laughter that escaped her when a bird startled us both. Slowly, I began to mirror her movements, my attention shifting from the ache of my past to the tangible, beautiful work of creating life. It was exhausting in the most satisfying way, a physical manifestation of the emotional labor I had been neglecting for so long. And yet Douglas remained a shadow at the edges of every moment. His texts became more aggressive, more insistent, and I began to see his visits at work as carefully orchestrated displays of intimidation. He seemed to understand the psychology of fear, the way uncertainty and shame could immobilize someone, and he wielded it expertly. But each encounter with Lydia fortified me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Her belief in my capacity to heal, her unwavering support, and her gentle insistence that I reclaim my life strengthened my resolve. It was not an overnight transformation. Fear did not vanish in a single afternoon. But with every seed planted, every tender sprout we coaxed from the soil, I felt a parallel growth within myself, a burgeoning courage to confront my past, to reclaim my autonomy, and to explore dimensions of my heart I had never acknowledged before. Then came the day the first storm hit. The sky darkened with heavy clouds, and the garden, usually serene, transformed into a theater of chaos and life. Rain began in heavy sheets, drenching the soil, splattering our hands, soaking our clothes, but we remained in the garden, kneeling together as we sheltered the seedlings and tended to the fragile shoots struggling against the water. Lydia laughed, and her laughter was contagious, pulling me out of my shell. She held my hand as we worked, guiding me with a touch that was both firm and tender, and for the first time I felt an intimacy that transcended fear and caution. When the storm raged hardest, our hands met in a deliberate touch, and the electricity between us was undeniable. There was no hesitation, no questioning. It was a recognition that something profound and transformative was unfolding, something that had little to do with romance at first glance, and everything to do with the rediscovery of life, joy, and self, in the presence of another soul who truly saw me. That evening, dripping wet and exhausted, we sat on the garden bench watching the rain carve paths through the soil. Lydia turned to me, her expression solemn yet kind. "Amanda, do you realize what you've done today? Not just here in the garden, but in your own heart. You faced fear. You chose to nurture life instead of letting anger consume you. You allowed yourself to feel something that isn't dictated by anyone else's expectations. That is strength, not weakness." Her words resonated deeply. For so long, I had equated survival with avoidance, with silence, with the suppression of desire. Yet here in the storm, I understood that survival could be radical. Survival could be rooted in choice, in love, in daring to nurture something delicate and defiant, even when the world threatened to destroy it. By the time the storm subsided, we were soaked to the bone, yet alive in a way that felt astonishing. Lydia brushed a strand of damp hair from my face, her eyes searching mine, and the unspoken understanding between us was electric. There was no rush to define what we were, no need to categorize the feelings that had begun to bloom between us. Instead, there was a shared acknowledgement that life, like the seedlings we tended, could flourish if given attention, care, and the courage to grow despite the odds. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, I felt my own heart expand, making room for trust, for hope, and for the daring possibility of love I had never imagined. As I drove home that night, the city lights reflecting on the wet streets, I realized that the journey I had begun was not just about escaping Douglas's control. It was about reclaiming my own agency, about learning that the life I wanted could be built one small, deliberate act at a time. The garden had become a mirror of my soul, and in Lydia's guidance I had found more than companionship. I had found a mentor, a confidant, and perhaps the first glimpse of a love that would redefine everything I thought I knew about myself. That night, as I finally fell asleep, exhausted and hopeful, I understood that the seeds of change had been planted, both in the soil and in my heart, and that the growth ahead, while uncertain, held the promise of a life I had never dared to imagine. Healing through the hands of another. Life in the weeks following that stormy afternoon in the garden began to take on a rhythm I had not thought possible. Each morning, I woke with a subtle anticipation rather than the hollow dread that had dominated my days before. Douglas's shadow still lingered, his threats and manipulations a constant reminder of what I had escaped, yet the fear that had once paralyzed me had softened, replaced by a quiet determination that I could no longer ignore. Riverside Community Garden became my sanctuary, and Lydia, in ways subtle yet profound, became my anchor. I found myself thinking less about the past and more about what could be cultivated in the present, not just in the soil beneath my fingertips, but in the intricate layers of my heart, which had been neglected for far too long. Every visit, every shared task, every laugh and unspoken glance planted seeds of courage, teaching me that healing was not linear, nor was it dictated by societal expectations, but rather by the willingness to show up, to trust, and to allow oneself to be transformed by connection and care. The intimacy that had begun with a simple kiss in the rain deepened slowly, almost imperceptibly, each moment layered upon the last. Lydia's touch was no longer merely comforting. It became a bridge to parts of myself I had locked away, parts that doubted, feared, and mourned. Her presence reminded me that vulnerability was not weakness, and that allowing someone to witness your pain without judgment could be the first step toward reclaiming the life that had been stolen from you. One afternoon, as we tended a new bed of sunflowers together, I found myself telling her about the nights I spent alone after Douglas left, the endless hours of insomnia filled with imagined confrontations and threats. She listened, her hand steady as she pruned a stray stem, her gaze unwavering, her silence more comforting than any words could have been. When I finished, she simply smiled and said, "You survived it all, and that is proof enough that you are stronger than you believe. You do not have to carry the fear alone anymore." Those words, gentle and deliberate, reverberated through me, making me realize how much I had internalized his toxicity, how much I had allowed his cruelty to define my sense of self, and how liberating it could feel to reclaim that narrative, not by confronting him directly, but by embracing the life and love that I deserved. As the days passed, our work in the garden became more than just physical labor. It was a ritual of reclamation. Each seed we planted, each sprout we nurtured, each fallen leaf we removed became symbolic acts of resilience and renewal. Lydia taught me to notice the small miracles that often went unseen. The stubborn sprout that pushed through compacted soil, the tiny insect pollinating a flower, the way sunlight fell perfectly across a patch of tender shoots. "Notice the growth," she said one morning, brushing a damp strand of hair from my face. "Sometimes the most profound change happens quietly, away from the eyes of the world. It begins in the unnoticed moments." And in that moment, I understood that my own growth, emotional, spiritual, and personal, was unfolding in the same quiet, persistent way. I was learning to cultivate not only plants, but my own resilience, courage, and sense of self-worth, independent of the judgments and manipulations of my ex-husband. Douglas, of course, did not remain passive. His interference continued, though it grew more desperate and erratic as he realized that the hold he had over me was slipping. Texts came in faster, filled with veiled threats and insinuations, and one day he actually showed up outside the garden, pacing in the parking lot with that familiar arrogance that had once reduced me to silence. But this time, instead of succumbing to panic, I stood firm. Lydia's presence beside me was reassuring, not merely as a companion, but as a symbol of the life I was choosing to protect and nurture. When Douglas's gaze fell upon me, I felt neither fear nor shame. I felt resolve. He could see the change, though he did not understand it. The calm determination in my posture, the quiet confidence that emanated from my interactions with Lydia, the simple joy in working with the earth rather than running from his shadow, all of it was a rebuke to his attempts to control me. I realized that true power did not come from intimidation or coercion. It came from understanding one's own value and refusing to allow anyone else to diminish it. One evening, after a long day of planting and pruning, we stayed in the garden long after the other volunteers had left. The sky was painted in shades of deep indigo, the first stars beginning to prick the darkness, and the air was fragrant with wet earth and blooming flowers. Lydia handed me a small potted plant, a delicate orchid she had nurtured through a particularly harsh week. "This is for you," she said softly. "Not because you need saving, but because you deserve to witness the beauty you can help grow." I held the pot in my hands, feeling the cool dampness of the soil, and I understood the profound metaphor in her gift. Life could flourish if given care, attention, and belief. That night, as we sat side by side in silence, I realized that my attachment to her was no longer tentative. It was not merely a response to my loneliness or fear. It was a conscious recognition of love, trust, and mutual respect. The intimacy we shared was not bound by labels, but by understanding and choice. And for the first time in years, I felt the exhilarating certainty that my heart was capable of growth beyond the trauma I had endured. And yet there remained a tension that neither of us could ignore. The fear of judgment, the lingering presence of Douglas, and the complexity of reconciling my past with the possibilities of a future all hovered at the edges of our happiness. Each visit to the garden became a delicate balancing act between embracing joy and maintaining vigilance, between surrendering to connection and preserving boundaries. In that space, however, I discovered the transformative power of patience, empathy, and courage. Healing, I realized, was not about erasing pain or avoiding struggle. It was about acknowledging what had been lost, embracing what could be nurtured, and daring to step into a life that was both unpredictable and profoundly beautiful. By the time I returned home that night, hands caked in soil and spirit invigorated, I understood something fundamental. The garden, and Lydia's presence within it, had shown me that even the most damaged hearts could find light, that even the deepest wounds could be fertile ground for love, and that freedom was not merely the absence of control, but the active cultivation of a life worth living. The courage to bloom. The weeks that followed brought a rhythm to my life I had never known, one that combined both the chaos of unresolved fear and the quiet beauty of rediscovery. Douglas's attempts to infiltrate my life had not ceased, yet each encounter, Each text, each sudden appearance, felt less like a threat and more like a measure of how far I had come. Where once I had flinched at the sight of his face, now I stood with a sense of guarded composure. Riverside Community Garden became not only a sanctuary, but also a stage where I could reclaim the narrative of my life. Each morning I rose, I was reminded that freedom was not just a legal status. It was a conscious, ongoing choice to prioritize growth over fear. And Lydia was at the heart of that lesson, not as a savior, but as a companion, a mirror, and a gentle guide through the wilderness of my emotions. One bright morning, the sun warm against our backs, Lydia and I worked on a new plot of wildflowers. She had insisted that the plot be her project, but in reality, she had designed it to teach me subtle lessons about patience, care, and resilience. I watched as her fingers sifted through the soil with a quiet reverence, removing stones and weeds, her eyes scanning for every imperfection. It was in those small, almost imperceptible acts that I began to understand the depth of her influence on my healing. Life, like the garden, required vigilance, but not obsession. Nurturing growth was about creating conditions for resilience, not forcing outcomes. Lydia's presence transformed the physical labor into a meditative practice, one that allowed me to confront the residue of Douglas's control without being consumed by it. The sun glinted off her hair as she leaned closer to inspect a particularly stubborn sprout, and I realized, with a mixture of awe and longing, that the love growing between us was rooted in these shared acts of creation, of careful attention, and of quiet courage. Douglas, however, remained a persistent shadow, though his tactics seemed increasingly desperate. One afternoon, I returned to my apartment to find an anonymous package left at my door. A note inside, simple, cruel, and familiar. "You cannot escape me." The instinct to panic rose within me, but it was tempered by the lessons I had been learning in the garden. I took the note to the kitchen sink and burned it, the smoke curling toward the ceiling like a symbol of a past I refused to let control my present. Later that evening, Lydia arrived without invitation, as if sensing my turmoil, carrying a tray of tea and a quiet, steadying presence. "Fear is natural," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But it cannot live where courage takes root. Do not mistake vigilance for imprisonment. You are not a victim. You are a gardener of your own life." Those words resonated deeply, a lifeline thrown across the chasm of anxiety that Douglas had cultivated over years of manipulation. I realized then that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act in spite of it, to claim joy and connection even while shadows lurked at the edges of your life. In the days that followed, our bond deepened in subtle, profound ways. We worked together for hours in the garden, exchanging stories, laughter, and quiet moments of intimacy that never needed words to be understood. She taught me to recognize the importance of small victories, a seed that had resisted growth finally breaking through the soil, a plant surviving a frost that had seemed insurmountable, or a moment of self-assured confidence where I had once cowered. Each of these small triumphs became symbolic of a life being reclaimed from the ashes of past pain. And as our connection grew, so did my willingness to confront the parts of myself I had long ignored, the desires, the fears, and the unacknowledged truths that had been buried beneath years of subservience and doubt. Lydia's presence did not erase my past. It simply illuminated the possibility of a future that was not dictated by it, a future in which love, trust, and self-respect could flourish simultaneously. Then came a day that tested the resilience we had been cultivating. Douglas, emboldened by desperation, arrived at the garden during our session, his face a mixture of anger and disbelief as he witnessed us kneeling together, hands covered in soil, laughter spilling from our lips despite the threat of confrontation. His presence was a calculated attempt to intimidate, to reclaim dominance over a narrative he no longer controlled. But for the first time, I did not shrink, did not falter. Lydia's hand found mine instinctively, grounding me, and together we faced him, not with aggression, but with unwavering calm. "This is my life," I said, voice steady, eyes meeting his with a clarity that had once seemed impossible. "You no longer have the power to control it. You never did." His scowl faltered, and I recognized, with quiet satisfaction, the first cracks in the facade of control he had so carefully cultivated. It was not triumph in the traditional sense, but a profound assertion of autonomy, the knowledge that courage, nurtured and unwavering, could redefine the dynamics of a life once dominated by fear. That evening, as we cleaned our tools and prepared to leave, Lydia brushed the damp soil from my sleeves, her touch intimate yet grounding, and I realized that our connection had evolved beyond the simplicity of shared labor or mutual comfort. It was an active, living thing, one that demanded attention, honesty, and care, and that reflected back the best version of myself I had longed to reclaim. In her presence, I began to see the full spectrum of possibility, a life unbound by the expectations and cruelties of others, a heart open to love in its most authentic form, and a spirit resilient enough to confront fear, embrace joy, and nurture the growth of both the garden and the self. By the time we parted that night, walking together through the quiet streets, I understood that the roots of my renewal had taken hold, deep and unshakable, and that the courage to bloom, even in the face of lingering shadows, was now inseparable from the presence of love, trust, and the simple, transformative power of connection. Love as resistance. The weeks turned into months, and my life, once a landscape dominated by fear and control, began to resemble something I had never dared to imagine. A life filled with intention, connection, and the quiet power of reclaimed autonomy. Riverside Community Garden became both a sanctuary and a classroom, teaching me lessons that no courtroom, no lawyer, and no restraining order could have imparted. Every day spent tending to the earth with Lydia was a meditation on resilience, patience, and love, not just for the plants we nurtured, but for ourselves. The physical labor, the dirt under my nails, the sweat on my brow, the careful tending of fragile sprouts, became a reflection of the internal work I had been doing, planting seeds of courage in the soil of my heart. Where once Douglas's shadow had loomed like a storm cloud, I now began to see the sky behind it, expansive, open, and full of possibilities I had long denied myself. Lydia was central to this awakening, not as a savior or a replacement for the love I had lost, but as a partner in rediscovery, someone who could see me in my brokenness and still recognize my capacity for growth, joy, and authenticity. Our bond, cultivated slowly and deliberately, deepened with each shared moment. The intimacy between us was no longer merely physical, though our touches carried a warmth that neither of us could ignore. It was the intimacy of trust, of shared vulnerability, of laughter that came without reservation and tears that were no longer burdened by shame. One afternoon, while planting a row of delicate violets, I spoke aloud the thoughts I had long kept hidden. My fear that I had lost the ability to love, my uncertainty about the future, my lingering anxiety over Douglas's presence in my life. Lydia listened attentively, her hands steady as she guided mine in the careful placement of each flower, her voice calm and unwavering. "Amanda," she said softly, "to love yourself and to love others fully, you must be willing to embrace both courage and uncertainty. Growth is rarely linear, and neither is the path of the heart. But you are not alone in this." Her words were both a balm and a challenge, a reminder that healing required not only willingness but deliberate action, and that love, when rooted in respect and authenticity, could flourish even in soil that had once seemed barren. Douglas predictably escalated his interference as he sensed my growing independence. Texts became more insistent, more threatening, and there was the occasional sighting at my workplace that left my stomach clenched with residual anxiety. But now, unlike before, I did not respond with fear or retreat. Instead, I acted with strategy and resolve, reinforcing boundaries, documenting incidents, and refusing to allow his presence to define my day. Lydia's presence was central in maintaining this equilibrium. She helped me channel my fear into proactive measures rather than reactive despair, teaching me that resistance was not aggression, but the conscious exercise of agency. We spent hours discussing scenarios, planning responses, and most importantly, reminding each other that the right to live without intimidation was non-negotiable. In these moments, I realized that love was not just an emotional experience. It was an act of resistance, a declaration that neither past trauma nor present threats could dictate the contours of my life. As the summer deepened, our connection became inseparable from the life we were building together in the garden. We spent long afternoons weeding and planting, sharing stories of childhood, losses, hopes, and regrets. Lydia revealed parts of herself I had never expected, her early years in foster care, the moments of doubt and isolation she had overcome, the subtle heartbreaks and triumphs that shaped her. And in turn, I shared my own history, the loneliness, the betrayals, the hollow victories of surviving a marriage that had felt like both a cage and a battlefield. Every revelation, every shared secret, strengthened the trust between us, anchoring our love in something deeper than attraction or infatuation. It became a partnership of mutual growth, a covenant not just of emotion but of shared purpose, to reclaim life, joy, and the right to define ourselves beyond the shadows of those who had sought to diminish us. One evening, after a particularly long day of work in the garden, the sky painted in streaks of gold and lavender, Lydia and I sat on the edge of a small pond we had installed together, our legs dangling over the water, hands intertwined. I looked at her, the quiet determination in her gaze, the gentle confidence in her posture, the way her smile could disarm the heaviest of fears, and I realized with clarity that the love I felt for her was unlike anything I had ever known. It was not simply passion or infatuation. It was reverence, gratitude, and awe. She had not only helped me survive the trauma of my past, but she had also taught me that the heart was capable of renewal, that identity was not fixed, and that true courage was rooted in vulnerability. When she leaned her head against my shoulder, I allowed myself to feel fully the warmth, the tenderness, the quiet certainty that I was no longer alone. In that moment, the garden around us seemed to bloom with the intensity of our shared understanding. Each flower, each leaf, each ripple of water a testament to resilience and the transformative power of connection. Douglas's interference continued, but its effect diminished in proportion to my growing confidence and the sanctuary I had cultivated with Lydia. One morning, a colleague at work cautiously approached me, whispering apologies for the past whispers and judgments, confessing that they had noticed my unwavering calm and composure in the face of Douglas's provocations. I realized then that courage, like love, was contagious. My willingness to stand firm, to embrace life fully despite past trauma, had begun to shift the energy around me. In the garden, in our shared moments of intimacy, and in my reclaimed autonomy, I had discovered that the true measure of strength was not in avoiding hardship, but in the conscious choice to thrive amidst it, to nurture both life and love, and to assert the unassailable right to define one's own path. That night, as we closed the garden gates and walked home together under the soft glow of streetlights, I felt the profound truth of what we had built. Our love, born of shared vulnerability and mutual courage, had become a fortress against the lingering shadows of the past. And yet, it was not a fortress built on walls or avoidance, but on openness, trust, and the deliberate act of choosing joy even when fear lingered at the edges. The seeds we had planted, both in the soil and in our hearts, had begun to bear fruit, delicate yet resilient, promising a future in which I could finally embrace the fullness of life, love, and identity without apology. In Lydia's presence, I understood that survival was not merely enduring. It was cultivating, nurturing, and daring to bloom in defiance of every storm that had ever sought to uproot me. Storms of the heart. The summer air had grown thick with heat and expectation, and the garden, once a refuge from my anxieties, now felt like a battleground where both growth and fear coexisted. Douglas had not relented in his pursuit, his interference escalating in subtle but increasingly insidious ways. Anonymous calls, cryptic messages, and the occasional sighting at Riverside Community Garden created a persistent undertone of tension that shadowed my days. Yet, unlike the paralyzing fear of the past, I met these challenges with a deliberate calm and strategic resolve, fortified by the grounding presence of Lydia. Her confidence and gentle wisdom were unwavering anchors in the midst of my storm. I realized that true resilience was not the absence of fear, but the capacity to act in spite of it, to continue nurturing life and love while shadows of past trauma lingered. In her presence, I felt empowered not merely to survive, but to confront, reclaim, and flourish, embracing the transformative power of courage and connection. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low behind a line of distant trees, Lydia and I were tending to a new bed of perennials when a sudden thunderstorm rolled over the horizon. The sky darkened in a matter of moments, the wind tugging at our clothes and hair, and the first drops of rain fell heavy against the earth. In the past, storms like this would have sparked panic and dread, a visceral reminder of Douglas's lingering presence and my vulnerability. Yet now, with Lydia by my side, the storm became a metaphor for everything I had endured and overcome. We moved through the garden together, hands working in tandem to secure fragile plants, our fingers caked with mud and water. Her hand brushed mine repeatedly, each touch both reassuring and electric, and in that chaotic, rain-soaked moment, I realized that the intimacy we shared had evolved beyond mere affection. It was a partnership forged in adversity, a bond strengthened by vulnerability, trust, and shared determination to cultivate life and love even in the harshest conditions. The storm intensified, and the rain poured down in relentless sheets, soaking us to the bone, but neither of us retreated. We laughed at the absurdity of our soaked clothing, at the way the wind twisted our hair into chaotic tangles, at the way the garden seemed to embrace the storm as part of its natural rhythm. When we paused beside the small pond we had built together, puddles forming around our knees, Lydia's blue eyes caught the fleeting light of a rainbow emerging through the clouds. "Do you see that?" she asked softly, pointing. I nodded, the vibrant colors breaking through the gray, and I realized that the image mirrored the transformations in my own life. Even after the heaviest storms, beauty could emerge, vibrant and undeniable if we nurtured it with care, attention, and love. Our gaze met, and there was no need for words. The understanding between us was complete. What we had built together, both in the garden and in each other's hearts, was resilient, enduring, and capable of weathering even the most threatening forces. Douglas, of course, did not remain idle. The escalation of his interference came in the form of a legal threat this time, a veiled attempt to intimidate me into relinquishing both my autonomy and my peace. When I received the notice, my first instinct was panic, a visceral flashback to the days when his presence alone dictated my actions. But I was no longer that person. I met the challenge with deliberation, contacting legal counsel and reinforcing boundaries, all while keeping the garden, Lydia, and the life I had begun to reclaim as my center. Lydia stood beside me throughout the process, her calm voice guiding me through decisions and strategies, reminding me that courage was not the absence of danger, but the conscious choice to act in accordance with truth, integrity, and self-respect. Together, we navigated the storm with the same care and deliberation we had once given to seedlings struggling against frost, each action reinforcing the metaphor that life, love, and freedom could flourish even under pressure. The nights became a sanctuary for reflection and intimacy. After long days battling both nature and lingering shadows from my past, Lydia and I would sit together in the quiet of my small apartment or beneath the open sky of the garden, sharing stories, dreams, and the unspoken recognition of the bond we had nurtured. Our love was no longer tentative. It was deliberate, conscious, and grounded in the understanding that vulnerability was not weakness but strength. I had learned to trust not only her, but also myself, to embrace the desires, needs, and emotions that had been buried under years of fear, shame, and societal expectation. Each kiss, each touch, each shared smile became a reaffirmation of the life I had chosen, the love I had embraced, and the identity I had begun to reclaim. One evening, as the garden lay bathed in the soft glow of lanterns and the distant city hummed quietly, Lydia reached for my hands and looked deeply into my eyes. "Amanda, you've grown so much," she said, her voice steady and full of warmth. "Not just in your confidence, but in your courage to embrace love and life without apology. You are no longer defined by fear, by control, or by someone else's expectations. You are free." I felt tears sting the corners of my eyes, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and awe at the journey I had undertaken. In that moment, I recognized that freedom, like love, was an ongoing practice, nurtured daily through choice, action, and the willingness to face storms without retreating into old patterns of fear. By the time the stars fully illuminated the night sky, I knew that I had arrived at a pivotal threshold in my life. Douglas's presence, while still a shadow, had diminished in its power to dictate my actions. My identity, long suppressed and questioned, had begun to crystallize in ways I had never imagined possible. And Lydia, whose love and guidance had been both catalyst and companion, had shown me that the heart was capable of resilience, the soul capable of renewal, and the spirit capable of creating beauty even amidst chaos. That night, as we walked hand in hand through the garden, the soft rustle of leaves beneath our feet and the distant calls of nocturnal birds accompanying our steps, I realized the full depth of the truth Lydia had imparted all along. Life could be reclaimed, hearts could be healed, and love, when rooted in trust, courage, and authenticity, could endure any storm. In her presence, I had discovered not just a partner, but a reflection of the strength and beauty I had long forgotten existed within myself. And for the first time in years, I believed without doubt that I was capable of thriving, not merely surviving, in a life defined by my choices, nurtured by love, and illuminated by hope. The garden of our lives. The arrival of fall brought with it a gentle shift in the rhythm of the garden, the air crisp, the sunlight soft and golden, and the leaves beginning to turn a tapestry of amber and crimson. For the first time in years, I could feel the weight of Douglas's presence lifting, not because he had been defeated by legal measures alone, but because I had been reclaiming my life, my identity, and my sense of self-worth in ways that were deeper and more enduring than any external circumstance could dictate. Each day spent alongside Lydia was a testament to what could flourish when love, courage, and resilience intersected. Our bond, once tentative and defined by uncertainty, had grown into something profound, a partnership of equals, forged through shared labor, mutual understanding, and the delicate cultivation of trust and intimacy. I understood now that the garden was not merely a refuge, but a reflection of our lives. The roots firmly planted, the stems resilient, and the blossoms a visible proof of care, dedication, and hope. Douglas's final attempts to assert control came as a series of increasingly desperate maneuvers, each met with calm defiance rather than panic. One morning, I found him waiting outside my workplace, his expression a mixture of disbelief and frustration as he realized that his power over me had been irrevocably diminished. He had underestimated the transformation that had occurred within me, the resilience that had been nurtured through weeks of persistent care, reflection, and love. I stood before him, not as a frightened, submissive woman, but as someone who had reclaimed agency over her own life. "You no longer have any hold over me," I said firmly, my voice steady, my gaze unwavering. Douglas faltered, and for the first time I felt the profound satisfaction of confronting a lingering source of fear without letting it control my actions or define my worth. It was not revenge, nor was it triumph over cruelty. It was the quiet, unshakable power of someone who had chosen to nurture life and love rather than live in perpetual reaction to intimidation. The liberation I felt extended far beyond the absence of Douglas's interference. It was the reclamation of a self I had long denied, the acceptance of desires and truths I had buried beneath societal expectation and fear. Lydia and I continued to work together in the garden, our hands entwined as we tended to the plants and to each other, each day a living proof of the resilience of the human spirit. Conversations that had once been tentative were now full of openness, laughter, and plans for the future. We began to envision our lives beyond the garden, not as a flight from the past, but as a deliberate creation of a shared reality that honored both independence and intimacy. Together, we dreamed of a home filled with light, love, and life, a sanctuary where our choices, our hearts, and our identities could coexist freely and joyfully. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast a warm glow over the garden, Lydia and I walked along the paths we had created together, the scent of damp earth and autumn leaves mingling in the air. She paused beside a bed of blooming chrysanthemums and turned to me, her eyes reflecting both the fading sunlight and the unspoken emotions that had been building between us for months. "Amanda," she said softly, "look at what we've built here. Not just this garden, but everything else. The trust, the courage, the love. You've allowed yourself to bloom even when fear tried to hold you back, and now there is nothing we cannot face together." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not of sorrow, but of profound gratitude and awe. Every struggle, every challenge, every storm we had faced, both literal and metaphorical, had led to this moment, this profound realization that love, when nurtured patiently and courageously, could transform lives in ways that fear and oppression never could. In the weeks that followed, we continued to expand our work in the garden, inviting friends and community members to join, creating a space where growth, resilience, and connection were celebrated. Each new plot, each seedling, each flower became a symbol not only of nature's beauty, but of the transformative power of human relationships grounded in trust, care, and mutual respect. I began to mentor others who had experienced emotional trauma, sharing my story and the lessons Lydia had helped me learn. That healing requires patience, that courage is cultivated through consistent action, and that love, authentic, patient, and fearless, can be the most powerful catalyst for personal transformation. The joy of seeing others reclaim their lives mirrored my own journey, reinforcing the truth that our hearts, much like the soil beneath our fingers, are capable of renewal and growth when nurtured with intention and care. The culmination of our journey came one crisp autumn evening, as the garden was bathed in the soft golden light of sunset. Lydia and I stood together among the blooms, our hands entwined, the air fragrant with flowers and the distant promise of rain. We had survived storms, both literal and emotional, confronted fear, reclaimed our autonomy, and cultivated a love that was deliberate, profound, and unshakable. As I looked at her, the woman who had guided me, nurtured me, and loved me without hesitation, I understood with perfect clarity that the life I had long feared I would never know was now my reality. Together, we had transformed not only the garden but the very landscape of our hearts. I felt a surge of gratitude, not just for Lydia, but for every challenge that had led me to this point, for every tear, every moment of doubt, and every act of courage that had brought me to this place of empowerment and fulfillment. Finally, as the sun slipped beneath the horizon and the first stars appeared in the night sky, Lydia and I embraced, a quiet acknowledgement of everything we had survived and everything we had built together. The garden, our shared sanctuary, stood as a testament to resilience, patience, and love, the living proof that even in the darkest of seasons, life could flourish, hearts could heal, and love could bloom with a strength that no storm could ever diminish. In that embrace, I felt whole, empowered, and ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that with Lydia by my side and the lessons of the garden etched into my spirit, I could cultivate a life defined not by fear or limitation, but by courage, connection, and the transformative power of love. The journey had been arduous, the storms relentless, but the harvest was breathtaking. A life fully reclaimed, a heart fully opened, and a love that would endure all seasons, just like the garden we had nurtured together.